No land force can act decisively unless it is accompanied by a maritime superiority. For proof of this, we have only to recur to the instances of the ease and facility with which the British shifted their ground as advantages were to be obtained at either extremity of the continent, and to their late heavy loss the moment they failed in their naval superiority. It follows then, as certain as that night succeeds the day, that without a decisive naval force we can do nothing definitive, and with it everything honorable and glorious.
George Washington was writing to the Marquis de Lafayette shortly after the Americans' victory over the British at Yorktown in 1781. Support by the French Navy at that battle, and by both the French and Spanish navies earlier in the war, had been critical to winning the American Revolutionary War and securing independence. America had its own navy during the war, but it was despairingly small compared to the navies of both its allies and its enemies. It's not that America lacked sailors. The former British colonies were stretched out along the coast. Goods shipped from Boston to Charleston were quite literally shipped, and merchant vessels maintained a steady flow of goods between America and Europe, as well as the Caribbean islands. And many of the colonial sailors would have been experienced in naval combat on armed merchant vessels granted letters of marque and reprisal. These documents, provided by Britain and other European nations, gave private parties the authority to attack enemy vessels. Do that without a letter of marque and you're a pirate. But with the proper documentation, you're a privateer. During Britain's not infrequent wars with France and Spain, American privateers got plenty of opportunities to learn how to man guns and board a ship. But privateers are not a navy. They lack the discipline, coordination, command, and firepower of naval warships. Throughout its history, America's shipping and coastal security had been protected by the greatest naval power in the world, the British Royal Navy. Britain had 131 ships of the line, the most powerful warships of the day. Only about a third were battle-ready, but to combat them, the Americans had none. Nor did they have a navy. Not until on October 13th, 1775, when the Continental Congress passed the resolution creating the Continental Navy. They ordered the building of some vessels and the purchase of others. By the end of the year, 17 ships were ready for service. Over the course of the war, the Navy would only ever have about 65 ships. Fewer than a dozen would survive the war, the rest being destroyed or captured. America would need privateers to augment the Navy. Between 1,700 and 2,000 privateer ships sailed on behalf of the new American nation, preying upon British merchants and transport ships throughout the war. The first captain given command of a Continental Navy warship was John Barry, considered by many to be the father of the American Navy. Barry captained the USS Lexington in 1776, capturing numerous enemy ships. And he commanded the USS Alliance when it won the final naval battle of the Revolutionary War in 1783. One of the most famous seamen of the American Navy was the Scottish-born John Paul Jones. Appointed a first lieutenant of the Navy on December 22, 1775, Jones was the first man to hoist the American flag on a naval warship. Jones had numerous successes at sea, and it wasn't long before he was made captain. During his service, he commanded various ships, either as a captain or as a commodore, a senior captain of a naval squadron. His most famous battle came while he commanded a small squadron of ships off the coast of England. The flagship of the squadron was a French merchant vessel, which he had converted to a warship with a battery of 40 guns. He renamed the ship Bon Homme Richard in honor of Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. In September 1779, Jones led his squadron up and down the English coast, hunting merchant ships bound for London. On September 23rd, he spotted a British convoy of merchant ships carrying goods to England from the Baltic Sea region, and Jones gave chase. The merchants were escorted by 2 British warships. Jones chose the larger of the two, the 50-gun Serapis, for battle with the Bonhomme Richard. The Serapis was bigger, faster, more maneuverable than Jones' ship, and its crew was much more disciplined. Yet, Jones threw his ship into the fight, bringing the Bonhomme Richard within pistol range of the Serapis. Things looked bad for the Americans. Over half the ship's officers had been killed or wounded. The starboard gunnery was all but gone. 18-pound shot had pierced the hull of the ship multiple times, and it was taking on water. And so, the captain of the Serapis called out to Jones, asking if Jones' ship had struck its colors, meaning surrendered. And Jones famously responded, "I have not even begun to fight." The ships pulled apart, and the broadsiding continued. But a fortunate wind and Jones' seamanship brought the Richard around and against the Serapis, bow to stern. Jones lashed the ships together, and the primary weapons shifted from cannons to muskets. The French Marines had lost their captain and lieutenants, so Jones took command of them and took up a musket to fire along with them. The British captain fought to separate the ships, knowing that if the battle returned to broadsides from cannon, he was certain to win. Jones knew that as well, and he directed his French Marines to fire at any British sailor attempting to cut the ropes holding the ships together. Fires broke out on both ships multiple times. Half the men on both ships were killed or disabled. One of the ships of Jones' squadron actually fired into both the Richard and Serapis, doing as much damage to Jones's ship as to the enemy. At one point, one of the Richard's gunners, believing his ship to be sinking, called out to the enemy for quarter. But before the British captain could respond, Jones knocked his gunner down with the butt of his pistol. Again and again, it seemed the Richard had no chance. But then, finally, the battle turned in Jones's favor. He had ordered men to drop hand grenades into the Serapis' main hatch. Now, one finally landed amid a pile of cartridges, setting off a chain of explosions and killing many of the British. Jones's men began to board the Serapis, and soon it was the British captain who struck his colors. And none too soon, the Bonhomme Richard had fought its last fight and sank into the Atlantic. But with the war over, America quickly determined that it could not afford even the remnant of the Navy that had survived. It was disbanded in 1790, leaving only a small force of revenue cutters, the predecessor to the U.S. Coast Guard, to patrol the coast. As a result, U.S. merchant ships now had almost no protection from pirates. Prior to the Declaration of Independence, American merchant ships were protected from pirates both by the Royal Navy and by British treaties with North African states. But soon after the war, pirates from the Barbary Coast began taking American ships. In 1784, Moroccan pirates captured an American merchant vessel. Algerian pirates captured more in 1785, and then continued over the next decade. America began paying tribute to the pirates. Congress reacted with the Naval Act of 1794, which authorized the building of 6 frigates, 4 with 44 guns, and 2 with 36 guns. The original 6 frigates of the new United States Navy were the USS United States, the President, the Constellation, the Chesapeake, the Congress, and the Constitution. Designed by Joshua Humphreys, the USS Constellation was the first U.S. Navy vessel put out to sea, and also the first to defeat an enemy ship. Humphreys designed the Constellation to be stronger than other frigate-class ships, but faster than the more powerful ships of the line. She was 164 feet in length with a 13.5-foot draft and carried 38 24-pounder guns. Another incentive for the Americans to take more deliberate steps in developing their military was the increased tension with France in the mid to late 1790s. While America had been busy creating a government of, by, and for the people, France went through a revolution of its own. And as American relations with Britain improved, its relations with now revolutionary France soured. Britain was again engaged in hostilities with France. The French were angered by America's apparent siding with Britain and attacked American merchant vessels. In 1798, Congress created the Navy Department to provide organizational structure to the service, and the U.S. Marine Corps to add to the nation's defense. The Navy sailed with dozens of ships, augmented by hundreds of privateers. The U.S. force performed well, capturing French ships and freeing some captured American merchant ships. In the new Navy's first major triumph, the USS Constellation captured the French frigate L'Insurgente, a fast 40-gun ship, on February 9, 1799. The prospect of America allying with Britain was enough to calm tensions and bring the parties to the negotiating table. War was averted, though not in time to save Adams from losing the 1800 election to Jefferson. And then it was time to deal with the pirates. For years, America had been paying tribute to pirates along the Barbary Coast. But when Jefferson became president, he refused to pay any more. The nation was behind him with the battle cry, "Millions for defense, but not a penny for tribute," quoting South Carolina Representative Robert Goodloe Harper, who had spoken in regard to the quasi-war with France. But the convictions behind his words seemed all the more valid when the enemies were pirates. In response, the Pasha of Tripoli, in present-day Libya, declared war on the United States. President Jefferson sent a small naval force to the North African coast to deal with the pirates. The American ships were initially successful, but in 1803, the frigate USS Philadelphia ran aground on an uncharted reef off of Tripoli harbor. The ship was captured, and her officers and men were held hostage by the Pasha. The loss of the frigate Philadelphia was bad, but the prospect of its use by the enemy was worse. The Americans couldn't leave the Philadelphia to the Tripolitans. If it couldn't be captured, it would have to be destroyed. 25-year-old Navy Lieutenant Stephen Decatur led a small group of volunteers into Tripoli harbor, sneaking in under the cover of night in a captured Tripolitan ketch or fishing boat. Yale American history professor Charles Henry Smith described Decatur's daring mission.
The little ketch, now named the Intrepid, with a company of 75 picked men on board, entered the harbor of Tripoli on the night of February 16, 1804, and, favored by the darkness and by the very boldness of the undertaking, which was enough to disarm suspicion, reached the side of the Philadelphia. Then the alarm of the Americanos was raised, and at the same instant Decatur sprang on board, followed by his company. The Philadelphia was fully manned by Tripolitans, and these came rushing up on deck from below. But nothing could resist the impetuosity of Decatur's attack, and in 10 minutes, he had swept the enemy off into the water and was in complete control of the ship.
But now, the mission became even more hazardous. The Tripolitans, anticipating a possible attempt to destroy the Philadelphia, had positioned it within range of over 100 heavy guns on shore and 24 armed ships within the harbor.
The noise of the conflict on the Philadelphia had of course given the alarm, so that not a moment was to be lost. Quickly the men sprang to the different parts of the ship which they had been detailed to set on fire, and so thoroughly and rapidly was the work done that some of the firing parties had barely time to reach the deck before being overtaken by flame and smoke. All was done with coolness and precision, even the rescuing of a wounded pirate who could not escape unaided from the flames. Back on the Intrepid, it remained to get her out, a very different matter from getting her in. The burning ship lighted up the whole scene, and the retreating boat received the concentrated fire of the batteries and the ships. Slowly making her way out, she escaped as if by miracle, and when out of range, Decatur mustered his men and found that not one was lost, and only one was slightly wounded.
Decatur's capture and destruction of the Philadelphia made him a hero both at home and abroad. The great British Vice Admiral, Lord Horatio Nelson, called it the most bold and daring act of the age. Decatur was soon promoted to captain and was later given command of the naval yard at Gosport, which today is the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. And a few years later, he commanded the 44-gun frigate, the USS United States, in the War of 1812. Britain and France were again at war, and America was insisting that it was a neutral party. But Britain imposed trade restrictions between America and France, which was both a hardship and an insult to American sovereignty. Furthermore, Britain had captured British-born Americans off of merchant sailing vessels and impressed them into service in the Royal Navy. Add to that Britain's continued support of the Indian tribes in the Northwest Territory, providing arms to Indians who then raided American settlements, and finally, in 1812, America could take no more. On June 18th, 1812, Congress declared war on Great Britain. Less than a month later, the frigate USS Constitution, one of the original 6 frigates of the U.S. Navy, ran into a squadron of British ships off the coast of New Jersey. The Constitution's captain, Isaac Hull, wrote to Secretary of Navy Paul Hamilton describing the encounter and the dramatic 3-day chase.
At daylight, or a little before it was quite light, I saw one frigate astern within about 5 or 6 miles, and a line of battleship, a frigate, a brig, and schooner, about 10 or 12 miles directly astern, all in chase of us, with a fine breeze, and coming up very fast, it being nearly calm where we were. Soon after sunrise, the wind entirely left us, and the ship would not steer. It soon appeared that we must be taken, and that our escape was impossible. 4 heavy ships nearly within gunshot, and coming up fast, and not the least hope of a breeze, to give us a chance of getting off by outsailing them.
The enemy ships were being towed by 6 or 8 boats each, with all oars in the water, so that they moved quickly, even without a breeze. With no wind to move his own ship, Hull, at the suggestion of his lieutenant, Charles Morris, used a technique called catching, or warping, to maneuver his ship. He sent boats out ahead of his ship with ropes hundreds of fathoms long, tied to light anchors. When the anchors dropped, the ropes pulled the Constitution forward and away from the enemy. But the enemy was soon using that same trick, and the Constitution struggled to remain out of gunshot of the larger squadron. Finally, after 3 days, the Constitution was able to escape. Then, a month later, the Constitution met again with one of its pursuers, the HMS Guerrière. Stephen Decatur, hero of the wars in Tripoli, proved himself again during the War of 1812. It was while he was commanding the frigate USS United States on October 25, 1812. Charles Morris described the event.
Captain Stephen Decatur, while cruising between the Azores and the Canaries, met the British frigate Macedonian. It will suffice to say of this conflict that after an hour's fight, the Macedonian was a helpless wreck, while the United States showed little injury from the battle. She had lost but 11 men in killed and wounded, while the Macedonian had lost more than 100 of her crew. The result, as before, appears to have been due to the comparative skill in gunnery, the hull of the British ship being pierced by more than 100 shots, while the American ship received but 3 in return.
The HMS Macedonian surrendered and subsequently became the USS Macedonian. Captain Decatur sent a crew to repair the damage, which took 2 weeks. He then brought the prize ship back home, again becoming a national sensation. Lieutenant Morris also described a later triumph in the war that was followed by a brave defeat. Captain James Lawrence, who had been one of the volunteers who followed Stephen Decatur in the burning of the Philadelphia, was commanding the sloop USS Hornet.
On February 24, 1813, the sloop of war Hornet encountered the brig Peacock off the mouth of the Demerara River, South America. The vessels were not unfairly matched in size and armament, yet so swift and sure was the Yankee fire that in 14 minutes the Peacock's flag came down, her hull being so riddled that before all the crew could be taken off, she sank.
In recognition of his victory, Captain Lawrence was given command of the frigate USS Chesapeake. Teddy Roosevelt, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy before becoming president, wrote of how the Chesapeake changed hands. It provides an interesting view of how a ship was crewed in the Navy of 1812.
It was very hard to get sailors, most of the men preferring to ship in some of the numerous privateers where the discipline was less strict and the chance of prize money much greater. A few of the Constitution's old crew came aboard, and these, together with some of the men who had been on the Chesapeake during her former voyage, made an excellent nucleus. Such men needed very little training at either guns or sails, but the new hands were unpracticed and came on board so late that the last draft that arrived still had their hammocks and bags lying in the boats, stowed over the booms when the ship was captured.
So with his unseasoned crew, Lawrence set sail from Boston Harbor. The British frigate Shannon, under the command of British Captain Philip Broke, was patrolling the harbor. Captain Broke was eager to strike an American frigate to respond to the humiliating losses the British had taken so far. Teddy Roosevelt summed it all up.
The lessons taught by all this were the usual ones. Lawrence's victory in the Hornet showed the superiority of a properly trained crew to one that had not been properly trained. And his defeat in the Chesapeake pointed exactly the same way, demonstrating in addition the folly of taking a raw levy out of port.
Lawrence's death hit one of his fellow captains particularly hard. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry named his new ship in memory of his friend, the USS Lawrence. And he took as his battle flag Lawrence's dying words, "Don't give up the ship." On September 10th, 1813, Perry commanded a successful fleet action against a British squadron of ships on Lake Erie. The War of 1812 continued on through 1813 and 1814. Along the way, Washington, D.C., including the White House and Capitol building, was burned in August 1814. And then, in September, Baltimore faced invasion as British warships tried to enter the harbor. For 25 hours, the British ships rained continuous fire on Fort McHenry, attempting to pass it and penetrate into the harbor. But they failed to pass the fort and succeeded instead in inspiring Francis Scott Key to write the poem The Defense of Fort McHenry, which would eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner. But finally, both sides grew tired of the costly but unproductive war. On Christmas Eve, 1814, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the conflict. But the war had demonstrated the value of a strong navy, with captains like Decatur and Perry and others becoming national heroes. The war inspired some to a push for a naval academy, similar to the U.S. military academy at West Point. But it was decades before Navy Secretary George Bancroft was able to secure congressional funding for the school in Annapolis, Maryland. The Naval School, with a class of 50, opened in 1845. In 1850, it was renamed the United States Naval Academy. Around this time, in 1846 to 48, the United States was at war with Mexico. The Navy played a key role in two major actions during the war, helping to secure U.S. victory. In 1846, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, under Commodore Robert Stockton, helped facilitate the capture of California. And in 1847, the U.S. Navy and Army conducted a joint operation, the first large-scale amphibious assault conducted by the U.S. military. The naval force was commanded during the landing by Captain Matthew C. Perry, younger brother to Oliver Perry. Charles Morris described the assault.
In March 1847, a fleet of 70 ships and transports was gathered before this port, conveying the 12,600 men of General Winfield Scott's Army of Invasion. It was decided to make the attack by a combined land and naval force, and land batteries were planted which began the bombardment on March 22, 1847. On March 25, the bombardment of Veracruz ceased at the request of the Mexicans. 3 days afterwards, the city was surrendered.
The war with Mexico would soon end, and as Charles Morris notes,
not many years afterwards, Commodore Perry performed an important work not only for the United States but for the civilized world in the opening of Japan to commerce and friendly intercourse. For several centuries, the island empire of Japan, incensed at the behavior of its first Christian visitors, had closed its ports to the world and remained persistently isolated. After the beginning of the 19th century, several efforts were made by European nations, and particularly by Russia, to put an end to this policy of isolation, but in vain. Commodore Perry succeeded this mission in 1852 and reached Japan in the following year with the steamers Mississippi and Susquehanna and the sailing ships Saratoga and Plymouth. The wall of Japanese isolation thus broken down, all attempts at seclusion were soon given up. The work of Commodore Perry has proved of more advantage to Japan than to any other nation, since that country has emerged from the position of an empire absolutely without influence in the councils of the nations into that of one of the leading powers of the world.
Perry succeeded in his mission to Japan, despite the loss of what had been considered by many an essential tool for maintaining discipline on a ship: flogging offenders with the cat-o'-nine-tails. The cat was made of 9 pieces of cord, with 3 knots tied into the end of each, all tied to a short wooden handle. The captain could order offenders flogged with this upon their bare backs. There were reports of sailors receiving 12 lashes for offenses as minor as spilling ink. In 1850, Congress outlawed flogging. Not surprisingly, many old hands were not happy. An anonymous naval officer wrote an article he titled, "A Plea in Favor of Maintaining Flogging in the Navy."
To prepare ships of war for the services that may be desired of them at any moment, they are carefully provided with heavy armaments, comprising the most improved inventions for the wholesale destruction of human life. And they are thronged with men who are more zealously taught to wield these instruments of death than they ever were to fear God and obey His commandments. And there is always in every ship a knot of abandoned and incorrigible vagabonds, sweepings of the jails and streets, the outcasts of the shore, who herd with the vicious portion of the seamen and form a turbulent and unruly gang, setting at defiance all moderate attempts to govern them, and having the fixed purpose of shirking duty and overturning decency, order, and law on board. The laws for the government of men thus banded together for the purpose of war are necessarily arbitrary and severe. The crew cannot be governed like any civil body because there is not nor can there be any parallel between their different condition.
This concern was felt by far more than this anonymous officer. And during the first few years after flogging was outlawed, reports of insubordination increased as officers sought new and more inventive ways to punish offenders. But Commodore Perry, knowing he had a long journey with few ports of call, chose instead to improve discipline by improving morale. He increased rations, encouraged visits between ships, and even theatrical productions to entertain the crew. His trip was a great success, which would have been impossible with an unruly crew. Perry proved that discipline did not require excessively harsh sanctions. But the Navy's great successes with regard to foreign interests, like Japan and Mexico, were not enough to prevent the United States from being ripped apart by domestic strife. When people think of the Civil War, they generally imagine the great armies of the Union and Confederacy blasting away at each other with cannon and rifle. But the navies played a critical part in the war. Indeed, the ships created for this war and the battles between them would change naval warfare forever. In fact, the battle that began the war involved control of a major harbor. 6 days after South Carolina seceded, and under the cover of darkness, Major Robert Anderson moved his regiment out of the indefensible federal Fort Moultrie and into Fort Sumter. Both forts were in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor, but Sumter, still under construction and previously unoccupied, controlled the entrance to the harbor. Anderson was in a better position, but he and his 85 men needed supplies, arms, and reinforcements. President Buchanan ordered civilian merchant vessel the Star of the West to be used to make the delivery, hoping it would be seen as less antagonistic to the Confederates. But as the Star of the West approached Sumter on January 9, 1861, cadets from the Citadel, who were manning the artillery battery on Morris Island, opened fire. Batteries from the now Confederate-held Fort Moultrie joined in, and the ship was forced to withdraw. Months later, South Carolina forces would open fire on Fort Sumter, capturing the fort and beginning the war. In the early days of the war, Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott proposed a naval blockade as a means of subduing the South. His Anaconda Plan, as it became known, involved using the Union Navy to cut the Confederacy off from the rest of the world. While the plan was not enacted precisely as proposed, the Union Navy would maintain a blockade of the Confederate ports throughout the war, and the Confederate Navy, once it came into existence, would work to help smugglers run the blockade and bring supplies to the southern states. The two most famous ships of the Civil War were the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. This was the first meeting of ironclad warships, and the whole world took notice. On the first day of the battle, the Virginia, which had been built from the remains of the U.S. wooden warship, the Merrimac, sank 2 wooden Union ships and crippled a third. On the second day, March 9, 1862, the USS Monitor arrived, and the two ironclads hammered at each other, eventually concluding in a draw. Confederate Colonel John Taylor Wood wrote of the reaction to their confrontation, the Battle of Hampton Roads.
The engagement in Hampton Roads was in some respect the most momentous naval conflict ever witnessed. No battle was ever more widely discussed or produced a greater sensation. It revolutionized the navies of the world. Line of battle ships, those huge overgrown craft, carrying from 80 to 120 guns and from 500 to 1,200 men, which from the destruction of the Spanish Armada to our time had done most of the fighting. Decided the fate of empires, were at once universally condemned as out of date. Rams and ironclads were in future to decide all naval warfare.
After the Battle of Hampton Roads, both sides built more ironclads. The Union, in particular, was able to build a sizable force of 50 Monitor-class ships. The following month, the Union Navy, with a small contingent of Marines, had a more clear-cut victory with the capture of New Orleans. Charles Morris described the campaign.
An attack on New Orleans was suggested to the Navy Department by Commander David D. Porter, who proposed as leader of the expedition David G. Farragut, midshipman under his father in the old Essex 50 years before. The suggestion was accepted and Farragut appointed flag officer of the fleet, and on February 20, 1862, he reached Ship Island near the mouth of the Great River of the West. Beginning April 18, for 6 days the mortar boats kept up a steady fire, while on the 20th, Lieutenant Caldwell in the gunboat Itasca made a dash upon the river chain, which he succeeded in breaking. At 2 o'clock on the morning of the 24th of April, the advance up the river began. The mortar boats poured shells into Fort Jackson in a steady stream. The fight with the Confederate vessels was more severe than that with the forts. The Cayuga, the first to encounter them, was soon reinforced by others, and for some time a brisk battle went on. The Louisiana proved of little service, and the Manassas, after a vigorous effort to ram some of the Union ships, was run ashore and abandoned by her crew. The battle ended in the flight of the unhurt Confederate craft, the Union fleet following triumphantly up the stream and reaching the levees of New Orleans at 1 o'clock in the afternoon of April 25.
Farragut demanded the surrender of New Orleans. The city rejected his demand at first, but finally did surrender on April 28th. The capture of New Orleans was a resounding victory, for which Congress honored Farragut by promoting him to Rear Admiral. Farragut is perhaps a bit more famous, however, for his words at the Battle of Mobile Bay. Historian Mabel Beebe wrote of the action at Mobile Bay in August 1864.
A double line of torpedoes, or submarine mines, was stretched across the channel. Above this lay the Confederate fleet. One of these vessels, the Tennessee, was a huge iron ram-like, the Merrimac. The squadron of Admiral Farragut was a strong one. There were 24 wooden war vessels and 4 ironclads, like the Monitor. The 4 ironclads were sent ahead close to the forts. The wooden war vessels followed, lashed together in pairs. This was done so that if one vessel became disabled, it could be towed by the other. Farragut wished to lead the fleet in his flagship, the Hartford, but his officers dissuaded him, and the Brooklyn went first. The Hartford followed.
During the battle, Admiral Farragut climbed high up into the rigging so that he could see past the blinding smoke. Fearing that the admiral might fall from the height, one of his men eventually had to tie Farragut to the rigging.
The ironclad Tecumseh was now leading the fleet. Suddenly there was a muffled explosion. The stern of the Tecumseh rose out of the water and she plunged bow foremost to the bottom of the channel. This was a critical moment of the battle. The backing of the Brooklyn caused confusion among the vessels following so closely upon each other. There was tremendous cheering and firing from the Confederates. They were sure that the victory was theirs.
Farragut was unwilling to give them that victory. Famously, he called out, "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" Despite these great naval battles, most of the water-based combat of the Civil War was not on the open seas, but along the nation's vast network of rivers. The so-called Brown Water Navy of Union River boats drove down the Mississippi River, capturing major cities and forts. When they captured Vicksburg and Port Hudson, they had complete command of the Mississippi, cutting the Confederacy in half. Union Rear Admiral Henry Walk wrote of the gunboats that the Union used so effectively.
During the spring and summer of 1861, Commander John Rodgers purchased, altered, equipped, and manned, for immediate service on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, 3 wooden gunboats: the Tyler, of 6 8-inch shell guns and 2 32-pounders, the Lexington, of 4 8-inch shell guns and 2 32-pounders, and the Conestoga, of 4 32-pounder guns. This nucleus of the Mississippi flotilla was completed with great skill and dispatch. They soon had full possession of the western rivers above Columbus, Kentucky, and rendered more important service than as many regiments could have done. On October 12, 1861, the St. Louis, afterward known as DeKalb, the first of the ironclad gunboats, was launched. The other ironclads were launched soon after. On the evening of the 6th of November, 1861, I received instructions from General Grant to proceed down the Mississippi with the wooden gunboats Tyler and Lexington on a reconnaissance, and as convoy to some half a dozen transport steamers. But I did not know the character of the service expected of me until I anchored for the night, 7 or 8 miles below Cairo. Early the next morning, while the troops were being landed near Belmont, Missouri, I attacked the Confederate batteries as a diversion. Soon after we returned to the landing place, our troops began to appear. The Confederates came en masse through a cornfield and opened with musketry and light artillery upon the transports, which were filled or being filled with our retreating soldiers. A well-directed fire from the gunboats made the enemy fly in the greatest confusion.
The river gunboats provided critical support to troops in the Western Theater throughout the war. During the Civil War, the Navy, which had historically been less racially segregated than the Army, had black sailors in its ranks even before the Emancipation Proclamation. Former slaves and free blacks served with distinction in the Union Navy. Men like Robert Blake. Blake had been a slave in South Carolina until he was freed in 1862 by Union forces. He then volunteered to serve on Navy ships, eventually serving as a steward on the gunboat USS Marblehead. On Christmas Day, 1863, the Marblehead was shelled by Confederate artillery on Johns Island, South Carolina. An explosion knocked Blake to the deck, and when he rose, he saw the powder boy who had been manning a gun had been killed. Although he was not serving in a combat role, Blake took over the powder boy's job, carrying gunpowder boxes to the artillery loaders throughout the battle. For his actions under fire, Robert Blake was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the Civil War, the Navy was rapidly downsized. David Farragut was made the nation's first full admiral. Before 1862, there was no official rank above captain, despite complaints as far back as John Paul Jones, arguing for the need to clarify the senior-most captains during larger operations. The term admiral seemed to carry a sense of royalty, going back to the days of the Royal Navy, so for decades, Congress refused to create a higher rank. Then, in 1862, with the rapidly growing Navy during the war, Congress finally authorized 9 rear admiral posts. In 1864, David Farragut was made the first vice admiral, a position above rear admiral. And in 1866, Farragut was promoted to full admiral, an American first. Farragut's adoptive brother, David Dixon Porter, was made vice admiral at the same time, filling Farragut's old position. Farragut died in 1870, and Porter eventually became admiral. Porter had been a successful captain and rear admiral during the war. After the war, he was made superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy, where he instituted a number of reforms, such as the honor system. He also brought organized sports to the academy, which would eventually lead to an all-new meaning behind the cry, Go Navy. And the need for improved training was clear, particularly with regard to the advances in weapons technology. But despite the improvements to training and weaponry, the Navy was actually in decline. Exhausted by the Civil War, focused on reconstruction, the nation did not wish to devote resources to its fleet. As a result, by the late 1870s, the U.S. Navy had fallen behind the other nations of the world. Legislation in 1883 authorized the construction of new steel warships. These ships were sometimes called the ABCD ships, named Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, and Dauphin. These ships were hybrids. They were given steel hulls and powerful steam engines, but were also able to run under sail. But eventually the masts and sails were removed, acknowledging the power of the coal-powered steam engines. The new Steel Navy would prove itself in the Spanish-American War. But the war would begin tragically for the Navy with the sinking of the battleship USS Maine. The Maine was in Havana Harbor, sent there to protect U.S. interests during the Cuban Revolt. On February 15, 1898, the Maine exploded without warning, killing most of her crew, 266 men. Though today, it is believed that the explosion was probably caused by a spontaneous combustion of coal in the bunker next to the magazine. At the time, it was widely believed that the ship was sunk by a Spanish mine. America was soon at war with Spain. The first battle between U.S. and Spanish forces was at Manila Bay in the Philippines under then Commodore George Dewey on May 1st, 1898. Commodore Dewey had been with David Farragut when the Rear Admiral had exclaimed, "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" Dewey followed his old admiral's advice and pressed forward.
Soon, the guns of the batteries in the Spanish fleet began to pour a storm of shot and shell at the American squadron. But, as yet, Commodore Dewey had not fired a gun. Finally, Commodore Dewey said quietly to the captain of the Olympia, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The flagship was now within range, and suddenly one of the great guns sent an answering shot. As its echoes went rolling across the waters, every man in the American fleet joined in the shout, "Remember the Maine!" These words were the battle cry at Manila Bay. Slowly, the American vessels steamed by the Spanish squadron in single file, pouring in deadly broadsides as they passed. The marksmanship of the Americans was wonderful, and at the end of 2 hours, nearly every ship in the Spanish fleet had either been sunk or was on fire.
Dewey's Asiatic squadron had captured Manila Bay with only 9 of his own men wounded and none killed. One of the heroes of the Spanish-American War was Teddy Roosevelt, the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. A few years later, he was President of the United States, and he was quite willing to demonstrate to the world America's new, strong Navy. When he advised, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far," the stick he had in mind was the U.S. Navy. In 1907, President Roosevelt sent 16 naval battleships on a mission to circumnavigate the globe. The ships, painted white to demonstrate America's commitment to peace through strength, became known as the Great White Fleet. These were all modern ships of the Steel Navy, built since the end of the Spanish-American War. They sailed out in 4 squadrons, manned by 14,000 sailors and Marines, and commanded by Rear Admiral Charles S. Sperry. They would visit 20 port of calls on 6 continents on a 14-month cruise covering over 43,000 miles. The primary purpose was to impress upon Japan the ability of the U.S. Navy to pivot from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Tensions were running high at the time. Roosevelt wanted to avoid a war and believed the Imperial Japanese government needed to see America's strength to be dissuaded from taking aggressive actions. The fleet left Hampton Roads, Virginia on December 16, 1907, and reached San Francisco on May 8, 1908. Along the way, they stopped in Trinidad, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. At the time, most people thought that the expedition would end there, with the fleet having reached the Pacific in excellent time, in first-class shape. But the fleet continued, visiting Honolulu, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, China, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Gibraltar, and then back to Hampton Roads on February 22, 1909. The trip was successful in its goal of easing tensions with Japan. That visit had gone extremely well, thanks in large part to Admiral Perry's diplomatic skill. It also demonstrated the capabilities of the Navy, which made the journey without serious incident. And it succeeded in raising the morale of the nation. But the trip also gave the Navy information about design defects and areas of improvement. And it demonstrated the need for bases overseas for refueling and supply. These lessons would strengthen the Navy even further, and at just the right time. For in less than a decade, American sailors, soldiers, and Marines would cross the Atlantic en route to World War I. In less than a century and a half, America's Navy went from non-existent to one of the greatest sea powers in the world. But the growing power of America's Navy was only just beginning. And America's sailors would continue to prove the truth of George Washington's words that with a decisive naval force, America can do everything honorable and glorious.